Good evening, and welcome to Forbes Library, Calvin Coolidge Presidential Library Museum. So we are recording this, so it'll be on YouTube, Forbes Library YouTube later. And so any friends who missed it, please share that. It should be up and live tomorrow. And we do have viewers at home watching now. So I'm Julie Bartlett Nelson. I am the head of the museum here, and I am thrilled to welcome Mark Murphy here with us to talk about his book that came out last year, Calvin Coolidge, The Presidency and Philosophy of a Progressive Conservative. So if you have not read it, we do have, I have one in my hands to borrow as well, or certainly put you on the hold list to get it from the library. It's also available online for purchase as well. Mr. Murphy spent some time in our collection researching here over many years and does have some local ties, but comes to us this week from Virginia. So we're pleased to welcome him back to Northampton.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. This is quite a pleasure to come back to Forbes and see that Northampton may still have a few Coolidge Democrats left. Thank you all. The main premise of the book is that the kind of pervasive federal government that we have today began not so much as a response to the economic collapse of the 1930s, the Depression, and then followed by the New Deal programs, but began to take shape during the mid to late 1920s, particularly at the state level, but more and more at the national level during the Coolidge presidency. And I think this is one way to think about Coolidge in history, to put him into some context, is that the country was changing, and he was resisting that change somewhat and moving with the change at the same time. And I'll get into that a little bit more this evening. But consider this period in the mid 1920s, late 1920s. The first attempt to subsidize an entire economic sector, agriculture, took place with the McNary-Haugen legislation and nearly succeeded. Coolidge vetoed the bill twice. The first scheme to have the federal government take responsibility for recovery and relief following a natural disaster, the Mississippi floods of 1927, partially succeeded. Coolidge was able to kind of scale down the federal involvement in the recovery and relief efforts, but unprecedented amount of federal government involvement, which of course we've seen ever since with natural disasters. So this is kind of the beginning of that, federal government taking responsibility for that. The first bill to provide federal funds for old age pensions appeared in 1928 and provided the basis for the historic Social Security Act of 1935. The bill in 1928 failed, of course, but built up a certain momentum within Congress, not to the point where Coolidge had to sign or veto legislation, but that whole movement began in the 1920s. The push for unemployment insurance, underway at the state level by the early 1920s, began to pick up support in Congress, mid to late 1920s. Never got to a bill that Coolidge had to sign or veto, but that whole movement began to take shape. Other initiatives during the decade include the first federal subsidies for social programs for venereal diseases, pregnant women, other took place in the 1920s, and an unprecedented benefit for war veterans, the veterans of the Great War. The bonus bill in 1924 that Coolidge did veto, and Congress passed over his veto, of course. So all that was starting to happen in the 1920s, well before the New Deal, and kind of created the basis for many of the ideals of the New Deal program that were in place by the 1930s, of course. Now, proponents of these measures during the 1920s held that local and state governments, charities, volunteer associations were inadequate to meet the societal needs in an industrialized nation like the United States, and the inequities in the industrialized and urbanized country that we had by the 1920s, with more people living in cities than in rural areas for the first time in our history, and that that the country needed a more robust federal government to meet the needs of the people. And in Europe, as you know, strong central governments had been prevalent for centuries, and social welfare programs were in place in Germany and Austria and Switzerland, Britain, even France a little bit, some other countries. And these go back to the Middle Ages with guilds and churches, and then the state governments gradually took over that kind of responsibility by the 1900s, early 20s, early 1910s, 1920s. So this is all happening in Europe, and the ideas were coming over from Europe through immigrants, through scholars, through literature, and kind of picking up momentum in this country, certainly by the 1920s. So in the United States, two developments made such a transition possible. First is the federal income tax enacted in 1913 during the administration of Woodrow Wilson. And second was the Great Prosperity in the United States that began after the war in the 1920s. And when you think about the federal government before the income tax, the government relied on customs duties and excise taxes for revenue. And those were limited sources of revenue that limited what the government could do. The income tax provided the capacity to collect unprecedented revenue from individuals and businesses. And even though the income tax started at very low levels at 4%, they began to rise to pay for the war, 1917, 1918, and they remained at a high level through the Wilson administration before Coolidge began to cut them. But they still remained the basis of federal revenue, far surpassing customs duties and excess taxes by the 1920s. And then the prosperity that followed the emergence of the United States as the global financial power after World War I provided the means, the revenue to collect. And this convergence led to rising appropriation proposals on Capitol Hill, claims on the federal treasury, with legislators, lobbyists, special interest groups clamoring, and then legislators from states in the Midwest and Upper Midwest in particular, sensing an opportunity to distribute national wealth a little more evenly. At the time, in the early 1920s, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Illinois, and a couple other states held about 50% of the national wealth. And so states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and so on, the legislators had most of the progressives that were pushing for these social programs, higher taxes, more government involvement in the economy, and so on, to kind of take advantage of that prosperity. So Calvin Coolidge was the first president to face these pressures. And the book argues that he was not a reactionary or an ideologue. He reviewed proposals by considering the impact on budgets, debt, and taxes, and their validity under the proper functions of the federal government under the Constitution as he saw the Constitution. He was a fiscal conservative for sure. I think he was a progressive conservative at the time when you look at his views on budgets, debts, taxes, and the role of the federal government. On budgets, He achieved reductions by cutting waste in line item appropriations, pushing his administration, his department heads and bureau heads to find savings where they could, without making drastic cuts in programs or eliminating programs. He produced balanced budgets each year without imposing austerity or slashing government services. And in fact, he signed into effect many large or considerable expenditures, like the Radio Act, 1926, the Aviation Act of 1926, and then again 1927. So he was not opposed to government expenditures, new programs, initiatives that he thought served the people as a whole, served the country. He said in one speech in 1924, "I am not advocating parsimony, I want to be liberal." But he was a president during a period of high debt from the war, and he was determined to get that debt down and produce a balanced budget every year. On debt, he believed that regular redemption schedules were the way to go to avoid overburdening contemporary or future generations and to maintain good credit for the government while returning surplus revenue to individuals and companies as much as possible. So he had a 30-year redemption schedule that Congress approved, and he kept to that schedule each year, but did not go beyond that. He said, debt reduction is tax reduction. And many at the time thought he was redeeming the $22 billion national debt too hastily, and some thought he was not redeeming the debt fast enough, and he thought he was right about in the middle, trying to strike a balance between contemporary and future needs. On taxes, I thought this was the most interesting part about researching Coolidge and his policies. And he was not a supply sider the way we think about supply siders today, the way the Reagan administration promoted supply side economics. Coolidge held that you had to pay for taxes. You had to have the surplus. His position was you produce the surplus and then return that surplus to the people in the form of tax cuts. But he did not believe that tax cuts necessarily led to more revenue or pay for themselves. He thought that was a theory. He said that in numerous press conferences. The National Chamber of Commerce was pushing for more aggressive tax cuts throughout his presidency. And I thought the most animated he became in any press conference during his presidency, and he gave two press conferences a week right through his presidency, more than any other president before or since. But the most animated he became was in response to a question about the Chamber of Commerce pushing for another tax cut after his historic tax cut of 1926. And he said, they're always pushing for more tax cuts, but never showing how to pay for them. And it's quite frustrated with the Chamber of Commerce at times, and with some Republican senators who wanted more tax cuts, more aggressive tax cuts. And he would always hold back and see how much revenue was coming in, how much surplus revenue was available. Interesting, and he also said, I quote, "It is far better to have no tax reduction than to have too much." He said that in 1928 at a budget meeting. Interesting, he and Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, who's known as kind of the godfather of supply-side economics, neither one ever pushed for a flat tax, the same level for all income groups in the United States during the 1920s. The powerful chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Reed Smoot from Utah, pushed for the flat tax for a while. Some other Republicans wanted the flat tax, which they saw as more constitutionally valid than the progressive income tax. But Coolidge and Mellon never went along with that, and the progressive income tax remained the backbone of the U.S. government finances throughout the 1920s and throughout recent history, right up until today, of course. And both of them, Coolidge and Mellon, opposed sporadic efforts in the 1920s to supplement or replace the income tax with a national sales tax. So in that sense, they were progressive on taxes. When you look at the three Coolidge tax cuts, 1924, 1926, 1928, they did lower the level for the upper income brackets, but they also lowered the level for the other brackets and the increased exemptions to even further lower the taxes for lower income brackets. So that stood out to me that Coolidge never would have abided by the tax cuts during the Reagan years or the Bush years, to name a couple more recent Republican presidents, during times of national debt and annual budget deficits. I see nothing in his speeches, or his press conference, or other research that would indicate Coolidge would have supported that. On the proper role of the federal government, again, he supported initiatives that advanced the country as a whole, such as spending on development and regulation of aviation industry and radio. But he opposed attempts to benefit special interest groups, provide social services, or infringe upon the powers, responsibilities of the states through what he saw as loose interpretations of the General Welfare Clause, Article 1 of the Constitution. When you look at the history of that General Welfare Clause, the framers, for the most part, intended to limit general welfare to the 18 defined powers cited in Article 1. They did not mention social spending, writing, or discussions, Article of Confederation, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, or during the state ratification conventions. Congress took a broader interpretation of the clause to fund internal improvements during the early 1800s, canals, postal roads, things like that. Among other, some presidents vetoed those actions, some let them through. So there's a slight struggle between Congress and the White House on what was permissible under the Constitution, the General Welfare Clause. But throughout the history of our country, leading up to the 1920s, Congress had asserted the right to determine the general welfare. Executive branch had pushed back at times, and the Supreme Court had avoided ruling on the matter as much as possible with some finesse, I would say. The push for spending that emerged in the 1920s would challenge this whole impasse and force the three branches to address the question of whether the federal government could provide a social benefit at the national level without an amendment to the Constitution. And the first social benefits came through the so-called 50-50 system of federal aid to the states, much like the education subsidy program in Switzerland, 1830s, and then the grant and aid system in England a little later in the 1800s under Prime Minister Robert Peel. So this idea that national level governments would provide grants or subsidies to the states, along with some guidelines, restrictions, oversight, and then the states would spend that money on various services. And that was pervasive in Europe by the mid to late 1800s. In the United States, that began with the Smith-Lever Agricultural Extension Act of 1914, signed by President Woodrow Wilson, accompanied by an annual appropriation to be divided equally among the states to promote educating citizens in agriculture and economics. This was followed by the Federal Roads Act, 1916, Smith-Hughes National Vocation Act, 1917, Chamberlain-Kahn Venereal Disease Act, 1918, Industrial Rehabilitation Act, 1920, and then the Shepherd-Towner Maternity Act of 1921. Now, these appropriations were small on a budgetary scale, but politically significant because they were funded on a continuing or automatic basis, which means Congress did not have to vote on them through the budget cycle each year, and the president would not have to decide whether to approve them on a case-by-case basis or veto them. They're all part of the budget. So they built up a certain momentum within the government at the national level, the state level. Congressmen like them. They're a way to provide funds to constituents back home. The states like them. This is free money, particularly the states with lower income levels. As mentioned, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, Illinois provided most of the federal income at the time. And then these subsidies and grants were a way to kind of disperse that money evenly throughout the country. So they were small amounts, but they were politically significant at the time. 3 months before Coolidge became president, May 1923, the Supreme Court issued 2 landmark decisions that backed the constitutionality of federal subsidies to the states for maternity care and suggested a broad interpretation of the General Welfare Clause. So the Supreme Court, after ignoring or trying to avoid ruling on the General Welfare Clause for more than 150 years, finally came down with the ruling in 1923. The first case was Massachusetts versus Mellon. It involved a claim by the state that Congress had assumed a power reserved strictly to the states under the 10th Amendment, and that the subsidy for maternity care was unconstitutional and exceeded the spending powers of the federal government as enumerated in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the Constitution. So Massachusetts, the Attorney General of Massachusetts filed this case in the court. The second case, which came up almost simultaneously, was called Frothingham versus Mellon. Mrs. Frothingham was a resident of Massachusetts who also challenged the same subsidy for maternity care, asserting that federal expenditures on health services violated the 5th and 10th Amendments and that her property, her tax money, had been taken without due process of law. So the Supreme Court decided to review these 2 cases together coming out of Massachusetts, and they determined that that state participation in the subsidy program was voluntary, and that a state had no power to institute judicial proceedings to protect citizens from the operation of federal statutes. So states could opt into these subsidies, they could opt out, but they had, a particular state had no authority to challenge the federal government on providing subsidies and grants to the states as a whole. And then on the second case, Frothingham versus Mellon, the court laid down the controversial, precedented principle that no single taxpayer or group of taxpayers had the standing to challenge a legislative appropriation because their contribution was comparatively minute. So this set the stage for the push within Congress during the 1920s to provide more benefits, more services under the General Welfare Clause. And that was what Coolidge was up against, in a sense, during the decade. Because, sure, thank you. So the rulings, by inferring that the court would not interfere with attempts by to use federal tax revenue for economic and social purposes, usually within the domain of the states, made it difficult, if not impossible, for the judiciary to check spending by the legislature. And the 2 cases advanced the cause of national supremacy and contributed to calls for a more activist federal government. And this became a rallying cry for the progressives during the 1920s, who, for all the divisions, disparities of views of progressives during the 1920s, they began to kind of refine their movement around economic redistribution and social welfare. And that was in full force by the 1930s, but with the New Deal programs. Coolidge opposed new subsidies. He restrained the growth of those in place and warned about them repeatedly. A Washington Post correspondent who attended his Memorial Day address at National Arlington Cemetery in May 1925 was surprised, along with most people in the audience, that he chose to spoke about subsidies on that occasion, and he spoke with more vigor and determination than he had ever heard him speak during his presidency, warning that the subsidies and the grants were a threat to undermine the states and shift the whole balance of power between the federal government and the states. And he warned about this repeatedly in press conferences and in states. He would bring up the issue with governors. The president would meet with the governors from around the country each year. They come into Washington, and he'd warn them. He said, "You're making a bad bargain with these subsidies. You're allowing the federal government to have more authority over the way you run your states, the way you run your programs, with federal oversight that came with these subsidies. You're making a mistake, and these subsidies will grow in time, and you'll lose even more authority." So he was quite against them. He twice vetoed the farm subsidies to prop up crop prices. And he did end one of the subsidies, which was the Venereal Disease Act of 1918, the first modern grant and aid program to be terminated. But he left the others in place. And why is that? I've wondered that throughout the research and in writing the book. I suspect he thought that the divided nature of the Republican Congress at the time, with the more liberal members in the Midwest and the upper Midwest, would prevent rolling back the subsidies or terminating them. I also suspect that the automatic funding of the subsidies would doom any attempt to end the programs, other than the one on venereal disease, which really struck a chord with some people at the time. And not only the Coolidge administration, the more conservative members of Congress, but a lot of church groups and kind of religious activists, other activists throughout the country were against that particular subsidy. It touched the nerve at the time, the nature of the topic. So that was the one that ended with his support. I'd say not so much as active support, but he certainly signed into the termination without hesitation, as far as I can tell. He also may have seen some value to the country as a whole in some of these subsidies and grants, such as road constructions and vocational schools. I think he saw some value in those two in particular. But I've gone on quite a bit about these subsidies because I think they are kind of the hidden story of the 1920s that gets too little attention. I think this is the wedge that led to the programs of the New Deal and the Social Security Act in particular, because that really began as a subsidy program. The federal state providing money to the federal government, providing money to the states to provide old age insurance. So these two Supreme Court rulings in 1923, these 7 or 8 subsidy programs that survived the 1920s really led to what we have today. Right through the New Deal programs, the Great Society programs, Obamacare, this is all traces back to these early subsidies. and that Coolidge, for all his warnings about them, for all his attempts to kind of sway national opinion about them, saw one go away during his time, and the rest remain in place. And that is really kind of the most important story or political story of the 1920s, in a sense. So the essence, and this is, the book is entitled Progressive Conservative. And Coolidge always said he was a progressive, and that the Republican Party was progressive. In his words, more work and better work for a smaller outlay of the money of the taxpayer is the real test of a progressive administration. So this was Coolidge trying to keep the interpretation of a progressivism in the movement on his terms. The way he became a progressive politician during his early years through the Massachusetts state legislature, as the mayor of Northampton, as governor of Massachusetts. He had a rather progressive reputation. He signed a lot of legislation to protect the needy, to provide certain benefits to the needy, to support unions. So he was a progressive conservative in the sense, in the old-fashioned sense, I would say, to promote good government and to provide necessary services, such as those many political and economic benefits that he provided as a local and state politician. It was not so much that he became less progressive as a president, but he thought that most reforms should be done at the state and local level, and that the shift in progressivism from promoting a more direct democracy through primaries and direct elections of United States senators, that kind of thing, and correcting problems in industry, such as we saw during the Theodore Roosevelt presidency in particular. He thought that shift from those two things to supporting certain constituencies was imprudent from a fiscal and constitutional standpoint. And this put him at odds with some Republicans during his administration and most Democrats on subsidies to farmers, bonuses and pensions to veterans, assistance to natural disaster victims, and insurance to older citizens and unemployed workers. Interesting that the 1920s had some of the worst natural disasters we've seen in this country, with the Mississippi flood, and then the hurricane in Miami, 1926, devastating, and then the great Midwestern tornado that swept through Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, a couple other states, the most devastating tornado in our history up until that time. The hurricane in Miami was the most devastating hurricane in terms of damage and loss of lives. And Coolidge would not provide federal support for any of those relief and rescue efforts. He was against that. He did provide the Red Cross, which was a quasi-government institution, still is. And of course, he sent the Army down there to provide whatever help they could with supplies. But as an aside, he was adamantly against that. He lamented, just to finish up some thoughts on Coolidge and his philosophy toward progressivism and changes in national politics during the 1920s. He lamented the influence of special interest groups on Capitol Hill. The 1920s where we began to see these lobbying groups on Capitol Hill with offices, with full-time lobbyists working the legislators, pushing for certain programs. The country had never seen that before the 1920s, but with all the money coming in from the federal income tax, the great prosperity in the country, heavy lobbying. In his words, he spoke about special interest groups. It is because of, in their hours of timidity, the Congress becomes subservient to the improprieties of organized minorities that the president becomes more and more to stand as a champion of the rights of the whole country. And that was his position, that he was the bulwark against all this pressure coming from Congress, coming from lobbyists to spend more money at a time when the country was in historic levels of debt, not seen since the Revolutionary War, or the aftermath of the Revolutionary War. Appealing to his fellow citizens throughout his presidency, he urged them to recall the ideals, founding principles of the country, to preserve their local and state privileges, and to maintain the virtues of independence and self-support against encroachment by the federal government. And the growth in federal spending and borrowing since the 1920s, following ever broader interpretations of the General Welfare Clause by the Supreme Court during the 1930s in response to the New Deal programs of the Roosevelt administration, have led to the formation of more formidable special interest groups that promote entitlements and hinder reform, as Coolidge lamented would happen. So I hope that provides a little context on Coolidge within the times, how he saw the times, how he was trying to move with the times, but not ready to go as far as some progressives within his own party and outside his party wanted to take the country at the time, and would take the country soon enough. And I would be happy to take any questions about the book or Coolidge or the research. Yes, please.
So you say that Coolidge considered himself a progressive, but did he lead any efforts in anything that was a progressive action, or he just let people bring stuff to him, and if it was progressive, he would sign, and he wasn't a leader in pushing it?
Good question. A good question. Again, I would say he was much more a leader on progressive initiatives as a state legislator, mayor of Northampton, governor of Massachusetts, not at the federal level. I think he would say that his efforts to promote federal regulation, federal oversight, and some federal spending for the aviation and radio industry was a progressive measure. Many at the time disagreed with him. It was more a necessity, given the chaotic nature of the aviation industry at the time, in the radio industry, and that was something that had to be done, not something that was particularly progressive. But Coolidge was a canny politician. He was not ready to let Robert La Follette in his progressive movement, his progressive party in the 1924 election, take the progressive banner. He said when a reporter asked him at the press conference whether he thought that La Follette posed a threat taking progressive voters from him, he said, no, we should not see this as progressive versus conservative. The Republican Party's progressive. This country's never had a party that was not progressive, and that La Follette was a different type of progressive, for sure. But Coolidge dismissed out of hand the election, that he was a conservative running against a progressive, or that his party was conservative. Yes.
When he was mayor of Northampton, he asked written how important it was to support our public education. And that the most important thing was to pay teachers well, because they're the foundation of our public education. But then he also wrote that same statement, the city of Northampton still has to be careful with its budget. Even though he's promoting paying teachers well, he takes a step back and he says, wait, we can only pay them as much as within his
Very typical of him. Yeah.
takes a step forward,
Right.
and he goes back.
Very typical of him. In fact, he supported the notion of a Department of Education within the federal government in the 1920s. This bill came up in Congress to have a Department of Education, and he spoke favorably on the legislation and indicated that he would consider and possibly sign such a bill, which would have been the only federal bureau or department Coolidge would have created as president during his time. Then he backed away from support, and this happened right at the time that his son died. In fact, he spoke to a group of educators right before Calvin Jr. came down with the blood poisoning. And he made a favorable comment about having a Department of Education doing more for teachers. And then he never made another significant public comment about that again after his son died, for whatever reason. But I would like to just, if I may, just make a comment about that death and the effect on Coolidge. I think the conventional wisdom is that Coolidge was never the same as a politician or president after his son died. And a book came out in the 1980s by a well-known writer, psychiatrist, making the case that Coolidge became clinically depressed after the death and rather lethargic in office. And I dispel that notion. I've read through all his press conferences. When you look through them, his command of the details of the budget and the various activities of the departments and the bureaus and legislation in Congress, and what was happening throughout the federal government, he had an impressive in-depth knowledge of what was happening in his administration and throughout the government, right through the end of his presidency. He made more speeches in 1926 and 1927 than he made in any previous year following the death of his son. So he was a tough individual, a highly disciplined individual, great sense of duty, and he got through the ordeal, which took a tremendous toll on him, of course, personally. But I see no indication that he let up in his duties during the last 4 years of his presidency. Yes, sir.
When his autobiography, Mike makes the statement that after Calvin Jr. died, the power and glory of recognition and blessing.
Yes.
So emotionally, it's a terrible thing.
Yeah.
But yet he had no strength, no luster, and continued his work.
Right. Right.
Do you think that kind of a depression is one of the reasons he didn't want to run again? 1927 when he made that statement?
Not particularly. I think he was concerned about the health of Grace Coolidge, who had a very serious illness in 1928, a kidney infection, kept her bedridden for a while, and the demands on her position were starting to take a toll. They were homesick. They were ready to come back. And I do think, even though he insisted that his abbreviated first term following the death of Warren Harding was not a full term, and that he was eligible to run for a second term under the Constitution, I think he thought that the precedent that Theodore Roosevelt set in all the other presidents who succeeded, who came into office following the death of a president, they all stepped down after the full term. Those who served out a term, were elected to their own term, they all stepped aside. And I think he thought that was best to preserve that tradition, even though he could run under the Constitution. Yes.
In general, Coolidge has gotten very little respect from historians throughout from his life. He is like this accidental president sitting in the White House between the Progressive era and the New Deal, and often dismissed as the do-nothing president. And based on your research, for example, and what you have told us, do you think it was fair to have dismissed Coolidge as a do-nothing president? And you think that in your research, in your reading, do you understand why Coolidge was treated so poorly by so many historians?
Good question. In his final social event at the White House, a woman from Boston came up to him and said, "Mr. President, you were so fortunate in office. You had no war, no depression, no great difficulties." And he looked at her in the eye and he said, "I never saw things that way. I did my duty as I saw fit at the time." So the point is that historians tend to favor presidents who have served during crisis times, wars, depressions, other things, and led the country through those times, rather than a president like Coolidge. I would not say he was a do-nothing president. The effort he made to reduce the federal debt during his presidency was an impressive undertaking. We've never seen anything like that in our history. The amount that he reduced during his 5 years, he took the debt from $22 billion to was $15 billion. Nothing like that. Not even during the Jefferson administration, which is the only comparative effort. So that was a tremendous undertaking. But I mean, the historians, I think, tend to favor more activist presidents that look for ways to expand the powers and authority of the presidency and the federal government as a whole. And Coolidge did not think that was healthy. He thought too that the country looked to the White House more than was appropriate. He said, this is one branch of the federal government. He thought that Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson in particular had put so much focus on the modern presidency, and through their publicity, and he wanted a more balanced approach. He wanted the country to return more toward the way things were in the 19th century, where the Congress and the White House were equal parties, and in fact, Congress was the stronger party for most of that century. So I think Coolidge thought that was more in line with our constitutional republic. I hope that answers your question somewhat. But I think Coolidge has gone up in the polls a little bit. I'm not sure the first famous presidential poll was conducted by Harvard professor Arthur Schlesinger in 1962. And Coolidge was, I think, third from the bottom, slightly above Warren Harding and James Buchanan. But Coolidge has come up a little bit in the more recent polls. He's still in the bottom third, but he's getting up. He's moving up there a little bit toward the middle. Any other questions? Yes.
About him not running a second time, what would you say to those who like to say that he got out because he could sense the economic downturn at the time?
Well, the story is that Grace Coolidge told an intimate right near the end of the presidency, quote unquote, "Papa says a depression's coming." That was what she called him, Papa. Now, she denies she ever made the statement, and I've seen no indication or evidence that she made that statement, or that she thought that, or he thought that. He did make a comment to Dwight Morrow, who's his former college classmate at Amherst, and his ambassador to Mexico, very close, intimate an advisor throughout his presidency. And Morrow thought that the country was headed toward an economic downturn, simply because of economic cycles. The country had been on a growth spurt throughout the late 20s. And, when you look at the history of the time, you got about 5 to 7 years of growth, and then a downturn, a recession, or depression, and then more growth. So that was the pattern back then, not quite as much today. So Morrow made a suggestion to Coolidge during the final months of the presidency that some hard times might be coming up, and Coolidge said that it was time for him to get out. He was good at saving money, but the next president might have to spend some more money, and he was not as qualified to do that. But I've seen nothing to suggest that he saw depression coming. And of course, Coolidge was kind of skeptical about some of the moves that Herbert Hoover made as president when the economic downturn took place, particularly the large tax increase and then the tariff increase that made matters worse. Thank you. Anyone? Yes. Yeah, it was for education and care. It was, for the states to decide how to disperse the money to hospitals, physicians, brochures, guidebooks, publicity campaigns. The states could do what they want within certain guidelines that the federal government set up. Yes, yeah. Some rise in venereal diseases after the war. Yeah. Yes.
Also, there was no adequate treatment for venereal disease at that time.
Sorry?
There was no adequate treatment.
Correct. Yeah.
There's some wasn't around at that time. Maybe some self-medication.
Right.
I'm not sure about the truth coming and stuff back here, but there was it wasn't an epidemic, but part of it was history
Yes.
It's difficult to appreciate Coolidge for what Coolidge was. It's difficult for us today because today we have, no matter who the president is, you have billions and billions and billions of dollars. And he's supposed to fix everything, solve every problem, make everybody happy. I think, and especially in the 1920s, the public did not expect the president, whoever it might have been, Coolidge, to solve all their problems.
Very true.
Make everything perfect. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think today we have such a hard time, people have a hard time, it's a challenge to understand or appreciate Coolidge's view of how government should operate and what its responsibility is.
Right, right.
I mean, Coolidge probably, any ex-president spinning in his grave, it's got to be Coolidge today.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, Madison warned in the Federalist Papers that the country would become too focused on the White House and the person in the White House. That this was the risk that he saw in setting up the constitutional republic and the three branches of government, that the presidency would become preeminent. And this has happened. Particularly during the 20th century, this with Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, John Kennedy, and so on. The very personalized presidency and the omnipotent presidency that you mentioned. This is what the founding fathers warned about. Oh yes, in the back, please.
Yes, I have my favorite question that I'm always fascinated by, as an archivist is, what exciting or surprising find did you discover in your research? Or maybe a favorite piece of your research?
Oh, well, the most kind of breathtaking moment was in the Library of Congress in Washington. I was looking through some folders in the manuscript room, and I came across the original note that he wrote in South Dakota in August 1927, handwritten on a small piece of lined paper. I do not choose to run for president in 1928. That was to hold that in hand with lamination, of course, was quite a thrill. Well, to answer that quickly, I took a couple of classes under Professor Howard Zinn at Boston University, and he was dismissive about Coolidge, just brushed right through him in a hurry to get to the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt. And that made me curious about him at a young age. And then, of course, Ronald Reagan put a portrait of Coolidge in the Oval Office, and that I think those two happening at the same time. No kidding.
Worcester Antiquarian Society. He borrowed one from Worcester's Antiquarian Society.
Oh, I did not know that. Interesting. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you. It's been a delight. I always like to talk Coolidge. What better place? Thank you.